General, I'd like to ask the government's views of the major questions doctrine that a number of my colleagues have asked about. And as I see it, there are sort of two ways that such a doctrine could operate. One is with respect to ambiguous statutes, ambiguous either because they're vague or because there are statutes that seem to have conflicting provisions, where they point both ways. And then the major questions doctrine is an aid to interpretation of that statute. It's essentially a kind of clue about how you should interpret a very difficult to understand statute. And the second way is there's really nothing difficult to understand about this. The agency action falls within the scope of the statutory authority. There's just no question that it does. And yet, because the agency action is kind of a big deal, we're just going to ignore the fact that it falls clearly within the scope of the delegated authority and say that, notwithstanding that that's true, Congress has to re-up it. So I think I'd like you to talk about those two versions of the major questions doctrine with respect to this rule. What do you think of those two versions, and which of the versions potentially applies here?
I think that perfectly encapsulates the two versions, and we think that this court's precedents clearly demonstrate that it's the first version that you articulated is the way that the court has previously considered economic and political consequences. So it's never been the case that the court has started at the outset by saying, does this seem like a big deal? Does this agency action have a lot of consequences? And then use that as a basis to depart from the plain language of the statute, or to say Congress has to specifically authorize it. We're not going to give the statutory text its ordinary meaning. Instead, in the cases where the court has looked at those kinds of consequences, it has always identified a conflict with other express statutory language, a conflict with other statutes that Congress has enacted that directly address the issue at question, or a conflict with the entire structure of the statute such that it would be unrecognizable to the Congress that enacted it. And it's only been in those situations where the court has identified a textual and structural problem with the agency's interpretation in the beginning, using those traditional tools of statutory construction, that the court has then gone on to say that its interpretation of the statute is confirmed by the economic and political consequences that would ensue. So I think it would be a sea change for this court to reverse the order of operations as the applicants are asking for here, and to start off by asking, does this seem like it has economic and political consequences? And it would ultimately do a disservice to principles of the separation of powers and to Congress's ability to have its clear statutory enactments, even if they're broad, given the effect that they have.
Justice Gorsuch?